On a cold November morning in Virginia, 71-year-old Samuel Carter parked an old Ford pickup truck beneath a row of maple trees outside one of the most prestigious private schools in the state. The truck was 22 years old. The paint had faded from navy blue to something closer to gray. There was a dent above the rear wheel. The driver's seat had been repaired twice with leather patches Samuel had stitched himself, and whenever the temperature fell below 40 degrees, the engine made a rattling sound for the first 30 seconds after starting. Samuel loved that truck. His daughter did not. "Dad." Samuel turned off the engine. "What?" 16-year-old Grace Carter was staring through the windshield at the long line of luxury vehicles arriving at Wellington Academy. Mercedes Range Rovers, Porsches, a black Bentley. A woman in a cream-colored coat stepped from a Cadillac Escalade while an assistant carried her daughter's school bag. Grace looked down at the dashboard of Samuel's Ford. "You couldn't take Mom's car?" Samuel smiled. "Your mother has been gone 9 years." Grace closed her eyes. "You know what I mean. The Lincoln?" "Yes, the Lincoln needs gas, Dad." Samuel laughed. Grace tried not to smile. She failed. "I hate you." "No, you don't. I hate this truck. That I believe." Samuel reached toward the back seat. He picked up a brown paper bag. "Lunch." Grace took it. "Thank you. Turkey sandwich." "Okay. Apple." "Okay. Cookies. Dad, homemade." "You didn't make them." "No, Mrs. Jenkins made them." Samuel nodded, "Which means they're edible." Grace smiled. Samuel watched her. For a moment, she looked exactly like her mother, some eyes, same small expression when she was trying not to laugh. Samuel felt the old ache. 9 years didn't eliminate grief. It merely taught a person how to walk while carrying it. Grace opened the door, then stopped. "You're still coming tonight, right?" Samuel nodded. "Parent reception, 7 o'clock. I know, you won't forget?" "I haven't forgotten anything important since 1986. Grace looked suspiciously at him. "Yesterday you forgot where you put your glasses." Samuel touched his shirt pocket. His glasses were there. "Not important." "Dad, I'll be here." Grace hesitated. "Dress nice." Samuel raised an eyebrow. "I own a suit. You own 6 suits. Exactly. Just don't wear the brown one." "What's wrong with the brown one?" "It looks like something a funeral director wore in 1974. Samuel laughed. Grace shut the door, then she hurried toward Wellington Academy. Samuel watched until she disappeared through the large stone entrance. Wellington had been founded in 1897. Its campus stretched across more than 90 acres of perfectly maintained Virginia countryside. Red brick academic halls, a Gothic chapel, a performing arts center, 3 athletic fields, an indoor swimming complex, a library that looked more like part of a university than a high school. Tuition was $58,000 a year, before books, before trips, before athletics. Many students came from families whose names appeared on hospital wings, law firms, investment funds, and political campaign donor lists. Wellington liked to describe itself as a community. Samuel knew communities could sometimes become clubs, and clubs always had doors. The question was, who was allowed through them? Samuel had worried about sending Grace there, not because she couldn't handle the academics. She was one of the best students in her class. But because Samuel understood the invisible weight of entering rooms where people assumed you didn't belong. He had spent much of his life entering such rooms. At 22, he'd been one of only 2 black engineering students at his university. At 27, he'd been the only black project manager in a company of 400 employees. At 35, he'd walked into banking offices where loan officers spoke to his white assistant instead of him. At 46, he'd sat in a boardroom while another executive repeated his idea and received credit for it. Samuel knew how prejudice changed clothes. Sometimes it shouted, sometimes it whispered, sometimes it smiled politely while deciding you weren't quite the right kind of person. Grace didn't know many of those stories. Samuel had never wanted to make bitterness part of her inheritance. He wanted her informed, not imprisoned, but Wellington Academy was testing that philosophy. Samuel drove away, He didn't notice the woman standing beside a white Range Rover watching him leave. Her name was Victoria Langford, 53 years old, chairwoman of the Wellington Parents Association. Her husband owned a chain of private medical clinics. Their daughter, Madison, was in Grace's class. Victoria watched Samuel's old pickup disappear down the driveway. Then she turned toward another mother. "Who was that?" The woman shrugged. "I think he's Grace Carter's father." Victoria looked surprised. "Really? Apparently?" Victoria glanced toward the road. "I assumed he was maintenance." The other woman laughed. Neither noticed Grace standing 20 feet away, but Grace heard them. She kept walking. Her cheeks burned. She didn't turn around. That was something Samuel had taught her. Not every insult deserved your attention, but some remained with you anyway. At lunch, Madison Langford sat across from Grace. Madison wasn't cruel in the obvious way. She didn't shove people into lockers. She didn't insult classmates publicly. Her cruelty was more refined. It came dressed in concern. "My mom saw your dad this morning." Grace continued eating. "Okay," smiled. "Does he work around here?" Grace looked up. "What? Like construction or landscaping?" Grace stared at her. "My father is retired." "Oh," Madison looked mildly embarrassed. "I just thought because of the truck." Grace put down her fork. "What does a truck tell you about someone's job?" Madison shrugged. "Nothing. I was just asking." Grace knew that sentence. Just asking. People used it when they wanted immunity from what the question implied. Grace returned to her lunch. Madison changed topics, but the damage was done. By 3 o'clock, Grace wanted to go home. At 3:15, her literature teacher stopped her. "Grace." She turned. Mr. Henderson was 62 and one of the few teachers at Wellington Grace trusted completely. "You all right?" "Fine." "You answered 3 questions today with one-word responses." "So?" "You normally answer one-word questions with 3 paragraphs." Grace smiled slightly. Mr. Henderson leaned against his desk. "Something happen?" Grace hesitated, then told him, "Not everything, just enough." Mr. Henderson listened. When she finished, he sighed. "People can be foolish. My dad says foolishness isn't illegal, unfortunately." Grace looked toward the window. "Sometimes I wonder if I belong here." Mr. Henderson's face changed. "You earned your place, I know, do you?" Grace looked at him. He continued, "Because places like Wellington have a way of convincing people that money and belonging are the same thing." Grace said nothing. Mr. Henderson smiled. "They aren't." That evening, Samuel arrived for the parent reception at 6:43. Grace had insisted on 7. Samuel believed being 17 minutes early counted as respectful. He wore a charcoal suit, white shirt, dark burgundy tie, polished black shoes, no brown funeral director suit. Grace would approve. Samuel parked the Ford beside a row of luxury cars. He could have taken the Lincoln. He chose not to. He had spent too many years proving himself to people he no longer cared about impressing. At the entrance to Wellington Hall, 2 parent volunteers checked names. Victoria Langford stood beside them. She was wearing a black designer dress and pearl earrings. Samuel approached. "Good evening." Victoria smiled automatically. "Good evening." Then she glanced toward the service corridor. "Deliveries are around the east side." Samuel paused. "I'm sorry, if you're here for catering, you should use the east entrance." Samuel looked at his suit, then at her. "I'm not here for catering." Victoria's smile became strained. "Maintenance staff? No. Then may I ask who you are?" Samuel studied her. There was no obvious hostility in her expression, only certainty. The certainty of someone accustomed to placing people into categories quickly. "I'm Samuel Carter." Victoria looked at the guest list. "Nothing." She looked again. "Do you have an invitation?" "My daughter attends Wellington." Victoria blinked. "Your daughter?" "Grace Carter." Recognition came. "Oh." Samuel noticed how much meaning could fit inside 2 letters. "Oh." Victoria recovered. "Of course." She searched the list. Carter, Carter. Samuel waited. Victoria frowned. I don't see your name, a volunteer beside her said quietly. Some students have only one parent listed. Victoria glanced at her, then back at Samuel. Perhaps you weren't registered. Samuel smiled. My daughter asked me to attend. I'm sure she did. But for security reasons, we can't simply allow... A voice behind them interrupted. Mr. Carter. Samuel turned. Headmaster Charles Whitmore was walking toward him. Whitmore was 64, tall, silver-haired, perfect navy suit. The kind of man who looked like he'd been born knowing where to place a pocket square. His expression changed immediately. Samuel, Victoria looked between them. Whitmore extended his hand. Samuel shook it. Charles, I'm glad you came. Samuel smiled. Grace threatened me. Whitmore laughed. She's persuasive. Victoria's eyes narrowed slightly. Whitmore turned. Victoria, I assume you've met Mr. Carter. Victoria forced a smile just now. Samuel said nothing. Whitmore placed a hand lightly on Samuel's shoulder. We should speak later. About the science building. Samuel's eyes moved toward Victoria. Whitmore understood and immediately stopped. Later. Samuel nodded. Victoria noticed. Of course she did. People like Victoria noticed anything suggesting hierarchy, but she didn't understand what she'd just heard. The science building. What did Grace Carter's father have to do with a science building? Before she could ask, Samuel walked inside. Grace found him 10 minutes later. She looked him over. Good suit. Thank you. Good tie. Your mother picked it. Grace touched the fabric. Her expression softened. I remember. Samuel kissed her forehead. How's school? Fine. That's the answer teenagers give when school is not fine. Grace looked at him. He waited. She sighed. Later, Stuhl knew better than to push. They walked into the reception together. The room was filled with nearly 200 parents. Crystal glasses, soft piano music, waiters carrying hors d'oeuvres. Photographs of past graduates covered the walls, senators, judges, surgeons, CEOs, a former vice president. Wellington believed strongly in displaying accomplishment. Samuel looked around. He knew many of the faces, some personally. Most people in the room didn't know his. That suited him. For decades, Samuel had intentionally avoided publicity. Carter Engineering had grown from a 3-person structural consulting company into one of the largest minority-owned infrastructure firms on the East Coast. Samuel had designed bridges, transit systems, hospitals, municipal water projects. Then he'd invested well, very well. By the time he retired at 63, Samuel Carter's personal net worth was estimated privately at more than $300 million. Grace didn't understand the full scale. Samuel made sure of it. He lived in the same house he'd bought in 1992. He drove the old truck. He did his own grocery shopping. He still compared prices on coffee. His late wife, Elaine, had understood. Money should make life easier, she once told him, not make people stupid. Samuel had adopted that as financial policy. Wellington Academy knew exactly who he was, or at least 4 people did. Headmaster Whitmore, the chief financial officer, the board chairman, and the director of development. 3 years earlier, Samuel had donated $25 million to Wellington. Largest private gift in school history. There had been one condition: his name would not appear on the building. No Carter Science Center. No bronze plaque, no giant photograph. The gift remained anonymous. Samuel had explained why. I want to know how this school treats my daughter when nobody thinks her family can do anything for them. Whitmore had looked uncomfortable. Samuel remembered saying, You learn a lot about a place by watching how it treats people it doesn't need. That evening, Samuel was about to discover more than he expected. At 7:30, parents were divided into small groups to meet faculty. Grace left for a student leadership session. Samuel walked toward the refreshments. Victoria Langford was talking with three parents. One man was Richard Palmer, an investment banker. Another was Dr. Allison Grant, a cardiologist. Victoria noticed Samuel. Mr. Carter, Samuel nodded. Mrs. Langford. She introduced him. This is Grace Carter's father. Richard shook his hand. What do you do, Samuel? Retired. From engineering. Richard smiled politely. Contractor? Samuel considered correcting him, something like that. Victoria glanced toward Samuel's old truck visible through the window. Must be nice to have your daughter at Wellington. Samuel looked at her. It is. Financial aid here is very generous. The words were casual, almost friendly. Samuel understood them perfectly. Richard looked uncomfortable. Allison glanced at Victoria. Samuel smiled. I've heard, Victoria continued. Wellington does wonderful work giving opportunities to families who otherwise couldn't afford this kind of education. Samuel nodded. That's important. My husband and I contribute every year. Good. Victoria seemed disappointed that he wasn't embarrassed. She tried again. Of course, families who receive assistance should remember how fortunate they are. Samuel's expression changed slightly. What do you mean? Just that Wellington depends upon donors. Samuel nodded. Schools often do, and sometimes people don't appreciate what goes into creating an institution like this. Samuel looked around the room. That's true, Victoria smiled. Exactly, Samuel continued. Sometimes people confuse paying for a place with owning it. Victoria's smile disappeared. Richard coughed into his glass. Allison looked down. Samuel politely excused himself. Behind him, Victoria whispered, Some people are very sensitive. Samuel heard. He kept walking. 5 minutes later, another parent stopped him near the hallway. Excuse me, Samuel turned. A man in his 40s held an empty wine glass. Could you take this? Samuel looked at the glass, then at the man. The man seemed annoyed. My glass? Samuel smiled. There's a table behind you. The man blinked. Oh. Samuel walked away. Now 8 o'clock. It had happened 4 times. Someone asked whether he was valet parking. Another asked where the restroom was as though Samuel worked there. A woman handed him her coat without looking at his face. Samuel quietly handed it back. The strange part wasn't that every person was consciously racist. Samuel knew life was more complicated than that. Some were simply making assumptions based on familiarity, class, race, clothing, age, context. But assumptions could still wound. By 8:15, Samuel wanted to leave. Then he heard Grace's voice. Dad. He turned. She was standing at the far end of the hallway. Her face was tense. Can we go? Samuel walked toward her. What happened? Nothing. Grace. Please. Samuel looked behind her. Addison Langford stood with 2 girls. They were whispering. One laughed. Samuel looked back at Grace. What happened? Grace's eyes were wet. She hated crying in public. Samuel knew that. One of them asked if you were here because the school needed extra security. Samuel became still. Grace continued. Madison told them her mom thought you were catering staff. Samuel looked toward Victoria. She was across the room talking to Headmaster Whitmore. Something inside Samuel shifted, not anger exactly. Weariness, a lifetime of small moments, small assumptions, small humiliations, the kind that individually seemed too minor to make a scene about, but collected over decades. They became heavy. Samuel put his arm around Grace. We're leaving. Grace nodded. They walked toward the exit. Whitmore saw them. Samuel? Samuel stopped. Whitmore approached. Leaving already? Yes. Everything all right? Samuel looked at Victoria standing nearby. She smiled. Perfectly, politely. Samuel turned back to Whitmore. Noter Whitmore's expression changed. Can we talk? Tomorrow. Samuel. Tomorrow, Charles. Samuel walked outside with Grace. The November air was cold. They reached the ford. Grace climbed in. Samuel started the engine. Rattle, rattle, rattle. Grace stared forward. I'm sorry. Samuel looked at her. For what? Making you come. Samuel's heart broke a little. You didn't do anything. They embarrassed you. Samuel put the truck in park again. Look at me. Grace did. No human being gets to decide my value by misunderstanding who I am. Grace blinked. Samuel continued. And nobody gets to decide yours either. But they think we're poor. Samuel smiled faintly. Would that make what they did acceptable? No. Then whether we're rich doesn't matter. Grace looked at him. Samuel knew the irony. Soon, everyone at Wellington might discover exactly how wealthy he was. But Samuel wanted Grace to understand the lesson before that happened. If tomorrow they find out I have money and suddenly treat me better, don't mistake that for respect. Grace was silent. Respect that appears after someone discovers your bank balance is just fear wearing a necktie. Grace laughed through her tears. Samuel smiled. Then his phone rang. Whitmore. Samuel ignored it. It rang again. He ignored it again. Then a text appeared. Samuel, please call me tonight. It's urgent. This is about the school's finances. Samuel stared at the message. Grace noticed. What? Samuel looked toward Wellington Academy, glowing beneath the winter sky. Nothing, but it wasn't nothing. 6 months earlier, Samuel had quietly agreed to consider another major donation, $30 million. The money would fund scholarships, faculty housing, and a new technology wing. No documents had been signed. No commitment was final. Tomorrow morning, the Wellington board was scheduled to vote on approving the campaign built around Samuel's expected contribution. And tonight, Samuel had just watched some of Wellington's most influential parents demonstrate how they treated a man they believed had nothing to offer. Samuel started the truck. Grace looked at him. Dad, yes? Are you angry? Samuel pulled onto the road. Very. What are you going to do? Samuel drove in silence for several seconds. Then he said, I'm going to find out whether what happened tonight was a few foolish people. He looked at Wellington disappearing in the mirror, or whether the school has forgotten what kind of place it claims to be. And across campus, Headmaster Charles Whitmore stood at a window watching the old Ford disappear. He understood something Victoria Langford did not. The man she had spent the evening patronizing wasn't receiving financial aid. He wasn't lucky to have access to Wellington Academy. In a very real sense, Wellington Academy had been lucky to have him. And by morning, everyone might learn just how expensive disrespect could become. Samuel slept badly. At 71, sleep had become unpredictable anyway. Some nights he fell asleep at 10 and woke at 6, feeling 20 years younger. Other nights his mind decided that 2:13 in the morning was the perfect time to review every mistake he'd made since 1968. That night belonged to the second category. He sat in the kitchen at 2:40 with a cup of tea. Elaine's photograph rested on the counter. She was 58 in the picture. Red sweater, warm smile. The photograph had been taken the Christmas before her cancer diagnosis. Samuel sometimes spoke to it. He knew she couldn't answer. That wasn't the point. What would you do? The kitchen remained silent. Samuel smiled. I know. Elaine had always preferred directness. She disliked wealthy people who pretended money didn't matter. She disliked poor people being romanticized for struggling. She disliked institutions advertising values they didn't practice. And she particularly disliked Samuel's habit of avoiding conflict until he had assembled enough evidence to conduct a congressional hearing. Don't build a bridge when you need to knock on a door, she used to tell him. Samuel took another sip. His laptop sat open. Wellington Academy financial documents covered the screen. Samuel had served as an informal financial advisor to Headmaster Whitmore for years. The school looked wealthy. In reality, Wellington had vulnerabilities. The endowment was substantial, but much of it was restricted. Buildings were aging. Faculty salaries lagged behind competing schools. Insurance costs had risen sharply. Scholarship demand had increased. Most importantly, Wellington's board had approved a 5-year expansion plan, assuming substantial philanthropic commitments. Samuel's proposed $30 million gift formed the foundation. Without it, the campaign wouldn't collapse, but it would become difficult. Very difficult. Samuel wasn't interested in punishment. He didn't believe charitable donations should become weapons used to demand obedience. But he also refused to finance an institution whose culture contradicted the reason he wanted to give. The original $25 million donation had been made largely because of Elaine. She had grown up poor in North Carolina. Her father was a railroad worker. Her mother cleaned offices at night. Elaine received a scholarship to a private high school that changed her life. She never forgot it. Education doesn't make people better, she often said. It gives them more choices about what kind of person they become. When Grace was accepted to Wellington, Samuel had been skeptical. Elaine would have loved the library, the music program, the scholarship fund. So Samuel donated anonymously, not to buy Grace a place. She'd already earned admission. He donated because Wellington promised to expand access to students who could never afford the tuition. The first 25 million funded scholarships and science programs. Samuel personally requested anonymity. The development office had argued. Donors of this magnitude usually appreciate recognition. Samuel replied, "I'm 78% sure that's why buildings have names." They eventually agreed. The new science center was named Horizon Hall. Students loved it. Most had no idea who paid for it. Samuel liked that. At 7:15, Grace came downstairs. She wore her uniform, navy blazer, gray skirt, white blouse. She stopped when she saw him. "You look terrible." Samuel touched his face. "Good morning to you too. Did you sleep?" "Some." "How much?" "Enough. That's not a number." Samuel smiled. Grace poured cereal, then looked at him. "Do I have to go today?" Samuel paused. Grace had never asked that before. "You want to stay home?" She shrugged. "Maybe." Samuel looked at his daughter. This was the danger. One cruel evening could become avoidance. Avoidance could become fear. Fear could become self-erasure. "No." Grace looked surprised. "You have to go, Dad. You didn't do anything wrong. They'll talk. People talk when they're bored. Madison doesn't get to decide whether you attend school." Grace's face hardened. "You don't understand." Samuel almost laughed. But he stopped himself. 16-year-olds rarely appreciate hearing that their parents understand things. Maybe not everything. He stood. "But I understand what happens when you start letting other people's ignorance choose where you're comfortable." Grace remained silent. Samuel picked up her lunch, turkey. She rolled her eyes. "Apple, Dad. Cookies." She smiled despite herself. Samuel handed over the bag. "Go learn something expensive." Grace hugged him, then left. At 8:30, Samuel arrived at Wellington. This time he drove the Lincoln. Not because he cared what anyone thought, because the Ford needed an oil change. He parked near the administration building. Headmaster Whitmore was waiting, Samuel Charles. Whitmore looked nervous. That was unusual. Charles Whitmore had spent 35 years in elite education. He could handle angry parents, difficult trustees, media scandals, and teenagers with remarkable composure. Samuel's quiet disappointment frightened him more than shouting. They entered Whitmore's office. Coffee waited. Samuel declined. Whitmore closed the door. "I heard some of what happened." "From whom?" "Victoria called me." Samuel raised an eyebrow. "What version?" Whitmore sighed. "She said there was a misunderstanding at registration." Samuel sat. There were several misunderstandings. Whitmore waited. Samuel described the evening. Catering, financial aid, wine glass, coat, Grace being mocked. Whitmore's expression worsened. "I'm sorry." Samuel looked at him. "That's a useful beginning." Whitmore leaned forward. "Victoria can be—" He stopped. Careful, opinionated. Samuel smiled without humor. "She assumed I worked for catering because I'm opinionated." "No." She mentioned financial aid because I'm opinionated? Whitmore rubbed his forehead. You're right. Samuel leaned back. This isn't about Victoria. Whitmore looked confused. Then what is it about? The institution. Samuel, we can't control every parent's behavior. Correct? But you can control what behavior becomes normal in spaces carrying Wellington's name. Whitmore was silent. Samuel continued. Did any staff member notice what was happening? I don't know. That's a problem. Why? Because either they didn't notice. Samuel paused, or they noticed and considered it ordinary. Whitmore looked toward the window. Samuel knew he'd struck something. Charles, why did Elaine and I support this school? Access and opportunity. And? Whitmore sighed. Dignity. Samuel nodded. Last night my daughter wondered if she belonged here. Whitmore's face changed. Grace said that? Yes, she's one of our strongest students. That isn't the point. Samuel leaned forward. Would she deserve dignity less if she were struggling academically? No. If we couldn't afford tuition? No. If I actually were a caterer? Whitmore said nothing. Samuel waited. No. Then don't defend us because we're secretly important. Whitmore looked down. That phrase hit him. Secretly important. Samuel hated the concept. Every person was important. Money merely made institutions notice faster. There was a knock. Whitmore looked annoyed. I asked not to be disturbed. The door opened anyway. Margaret Ellis entered. Chairwoman of Wellington's Board of Trustees, 67, former federal judge, sharp eyes, gray hair. Margaret had known Samuel for 25 years. Sorry. She looked at Samuel. I heard. Samuel smiled slightly. News travels, especially bad news. She sat. Whitmore sighed. Victoria called you? No, Richard Palmer. Samuel remembered the investment banker. Margaret looked furious. He said Victoria spent 10 minutes explaining financial aid to the man funding half our current capital program. Samuel's eyes narrowed. That's not the issue. Margaret held up the hand. I know. She understood him better than Whitmore did. Margaret had grown up in Alabama, first black woman appointed to the federal bench in her district. She knew what it meant to be underestimated. How's Grace? Embarrassed, angry, mostly hurt. Margaret nodded. What do you want? Samuel considered. That was a dangerous question. People assumed donors always wanted something. Names, influence, access. Samuel had wanted very little until now. I want the school to investigate whether this is isolated. Whitmore frowned. How? Ask students. About race, about belonging. Samuel looked at both of them. Race, class, disability, religion, financial aid, family background. Margaret nodded slowly. An anonymous survey, independent. Whitmore looked concerned. We have the board meeting this afternoon, I know. And the campaign vote, I know. Are you withdrawing? Samuel didn't answer immediately. Whitmore looked pale. Margaret watched him carefully. Samuel finally said, I'm postponing my commitment. Whitmore closed his eyes. Margaret remained still until I understand what I'm funding. Whitmore stood. Samuel, the campaign was built around, that's your mistake. Whitmore stopped. Samuel's voice remained calm. Never build an institution around money you haven't received. Whitmore sat again. Samuel continued. I'm not withdrawing my existing support, Margaret nodded. But the new gift? No decision. Whitmore looked genuinely frightened. Samuel understood why. $30 million. Faculty housing, scholarships, technology center. 3 years of planning, all uncertain, but Samuel wasn't enjoying this. He didn't want leverage, he wanted evidence. The board should proceed without assuming my money. Whitmore stared at him. That's going to cause panic, then tell them the truth. Margaret spoke. What truth? Samuel looked at her. that a donor visited campus anonymously and didn't like what he saw. Margaret smiled faintly. That's going to cause more panic. Good. Whitmore looked at both of them. You two are enjoying this. No, Samuel said. Margaret said, a little. Samuel laughed despite himself. At noon, Victoria Langford entered the Wellington dining room for a Parents' Association luncheon. She was annoyed. Richard Palmer had been strangely cold that morning. Allison Grant hadn't returned her call, and Headmaster Whitmore had sent a message requesting a private meeting at 4. Victoria assumed it concerned the misunderstanding with Samuel Carter. She wasn't worried. Elite institutions survived because people like her volunteered, people like her husband donated, people like her organized fundraisers. She had given Wellington nearly $400,000 over 8 years, a substantial amount. Victoria believed gratitude was appropriate. At lunch, she sat beside another parent. Have you heard anything about this afternoon's board meeting? The woman shrugged. Something about the capital campaign. Victoria smiled. Her husband hoped to have a laboratory named after his father. They had discussed a $2 million pledge. Naming rights mattered to him. Across the room, Richard Palmer entered. Victoria waved. He hesitated, then approached. Richard, Victoria. You disappeared last night, had an early meeting. Victoria leaned closer. Do you know why Charles wants to see me? Richard looked at her. You really don't know who Samuel Carter is? Victoria frowned. Grace's father, yes. Retired engineer. Richard stared at her. Retired engineer, what he said? Richard sat. Victoria, do you know Carter Infrastructure Group? She paused. Of course she did. Everyone in regional business knew Carter Infrastructure, bridges, rail projects, airports, federal contracts. She looked at Richard. No. He nodded. Yes, Victoria's face changed. Samuel Carter founded it. She stared at him. Richard continued. Sold part of it 15 years ago. Still owns a major stake. Victoria's hand tightened around her water glass. How wealthy? Richard hesitated. Very, how wealthy. Probably several $100 million. Victoria felt heat rising into her face. Then she recovered. Wealth she could understand. Wealth could be apologized to. I didn't know. Richard looked disappointed. That shouldn't matter. Victoria's eyes narrowed. What? You shouldn't need his net worth before deciding not to treat him like staff. Victoria stared. That's unfair, is it? He arrived unregistered. He wasn't unregistered. What? His name was on Whitmore's personal guest list. Victoria looked away. Richard continued. And the financial aid comment? I was being welcoming. No, you weren't. Victoria's face hardened. Excuse me, Richard sighed. I've known you 15 years. You were reminding him of his place. Victoria stood. I will not be spoken to like this. Richard looked up. That's probably part of the problem. Victoria left. Her humiliation quickly transformed into anger. By 4 o'clock, she was ready to defend herself. Headmaster Whitmore's office contained 4 people. Whitmore, Margaret Ellis, the school's attorney, and Samuel Carter. Victoria stopped. Mr. Carter. Samuel nodded. Mrs. Langford. She entered. Whitmore closed the door. Victoria sat. I understand there are concerns about last night. Samuel said nothing. Victoria continued. I'd like to apologize if anything I said was misunderstood. Margaret's expression changed. Samuel remained calm. Misunderstood? Victoria nodded. I certainly didn't intend to offend you. Samuel looked at her. Would you have been concerned about offending me if you hadn't learned who I was? Victoria froze. Whitmore glanced downward. Victoria recovered. I don't understand. Samuel leaned forward. Last night you believed I might work in catering. That was a misunderstanding. Then you believed I might receive financial aid. I support financial aid. Good. Victoria's voice tightened. I don't see what you're accusing me of. Samuel thought for a moment. I'm not accusing you of anything. Victoria blinked. I'm telling you how you behaved. Silence, Samuel continued. And I'm asking whether your behavior would change if I really were a catering employee. Victoria said nothing. Samuel waited. If I cleaned these floors? Nothing. If Grace attended on full scholarship? Victoria looked defensive. I treat everyone with respect. Margaret finally spoke. That is not what witnesses described. Victoria turned. Witnesses? Whitmore said, several parents reported concerns. Victoria stared at him. You're investigating me? We're reviewing the event. Her eyes moved toward Samuel. Because he complained? Samuel almost smiled. There it was. Victoria still didn't understand. This is exactly what I'm talking about. What? You keep making this about who I am. Victoria looked confused. Samuel stood. I'm not asking Wellington to protect Samuel Carter. He pointed toward the window. I'm asking Wellington what it would have done if I were Sam the janitor, and my daughter went home believing she didn't belong. Victoria remained silent. Samuel walked toward the door, then stopped. One more thing. Everyone looked at him. The money. Victoria's expression changed. She knew. Samuel saw it. It isn't mine. Victoria frowned. Samuel smiled faintly. Not in the way you're thinking, he continued. Money is temporary responsibility. My wife and I earned more than we needed. We decided some of it should create opportunities. Samuel looked toward Whitmore. If Wellington wants that responsibility, then it needs to demonstrate that opportunity here comes with dignity. Then he left. Victoria watched the door close. She turned slowly toward Whitmore. How much has he donated? Whitmore didn't answer. Margaret did. 25 million. Victoria's face went white. And the proposed gift? Margaret looked directly at her. 30 million. Victoria leaned back. For the first time in her life, Victoria Langford understood what it felt like to discover that the person she considered powerless had possessed extraordinary influence all along. But Samuel Carter wasn't finished, because that afternoon, while adults worried about donations and reputations, another problem was unfolding among the students. Madison Langford had learned who Grace's father was, and within 30 minutes, half the school knew. Grace walked into chemistry class. A boy near the window whispered, "That's her." Someone else said, "Her dad's like a billionaire." Another student turned. "Why does he drive that piece of junk truck?" Grace stopped. Yesterday, they thought she didn't belong because they believed her family had too little. Today, they stared because they believed her family had too much. Grace suddenly understood her father's warning. If people treated you differently because they discovered your bank balance, that wasn't respect. It was something uglier. She sat at her desk. Madison entered. Their eyes met. Madison looked away. For the first time, Grace saw something she hadn't expected. Madison was embarrassed. Good, Grace thought. Then she immediately felt ashamed for enjoying it. Mr. Henderson began class, but Grace barely heard him. At lunchtime, students who had ignored her for months suddenly wanted to sit nearby. One girl asked, "Is your dad really worth 300 million?" Grace stared. "I don't know. How can you not know?" "Because I don't ask him." "Do you have a private jet?" Grace laughed. "No." "A yacht?" "No." "House in Europe?" "No." The girl looked disappointed. Grace picked up her lunch. Turkey, apple, cookies, same brown paper bag. She suddenly loved it. She stood. "Where are you going?" "Somewhere people know how to talk about something besides money." Grace walked outside. Mr. Henderson was sitting beneath an oak tree eating soup from a thermos. Grace sat beside him. He looked at her paper bag. "Cookies?" "Yes." "Homemade?" "Mrs. Jenkins." He nodded. "Excellent." Grace gave him one. For several minutes, Neither spoke. Then Henderson said, "Interesting day," Grace laughed. "You knew? Teachers know everything." "That's terrifying." "It should be." Grace looked across campus. "Yesterday they thought my dad was poor." Henderson nodded. "Today they think he's some kind of secret billionaire." "Which is worse?" Grace considered. "They're both stupid." Henderson smiled. "Good answer." Grace broke the cookie. "My dad says money doesn't tell you who someone is. Your father sounds annoyingly wise." "He is. Occupational hazard of getting old." Grace looked at him. "He's 71. Ancient." Grace laughed. Then her expression became serious. "Do you know what bothers me?" "What?" I liked when Madison looked embarrassed. Henderson nodded. "That's human. I wanted her to feel stupid." "Also human. Does that make me bad?" "No." He took another spoonful of soup. "It gives you a decision." Grace frowned. "What decision? Whether you want justice or humiliation," she thought. "They humiliated Dad. Yes, so why shouldn't they feel it?" Henderson looked at her, because if humiliation becomes the goal, eventually you start resembling the people who hurt you. Grace looked away. That sounded like something her father would say. She hated when adults agreed. At 4:30, Samuel picked her up. Students noticed the Lincoln, one boy whispered. Grace climbed inside. "Can we take the truck tomorrow?" Samuel looked surprised. "I thought you hated the truck. I changed my mind." Samuel smiled slowly. "Why?" Grace fastened her seatbelt. "Because people are idiots." Samuel laughed so loudly that a teacher turned around. Then Grace became serious. "Dad, yes, everybody knows. I know. Are you upset?" "A little." "Why did you keep it secret?" Samuel pulled from the parking lot. "Because I wanted you to have a childhood?" Grace stared. "What does that mean?" "It means money changes rooms." "How?" "People laugh harder at your jokes." Grace smiled. "Yours need help." "Exactly," he continued. "People agree faster, invite you places, forgive bad behavior, pretend your ordinary opinions are brilliant," Grace thought. "So rich people can't have real friends?" "I didn't say that." "Then?" "They have to pay attention." Samuel looked at her. "Everyone should." At the entrance to campus, they passed a stone sign. Wellington Academy Character, Knowledge, Service. Grace read it, then looked at Samuel. "Do you still want me here?" Samuel considered. "Don't know yet." Grace's stomach tightened. Wellington had been her dream school. Despite everything, she loved her teachers, the library, the science program, the orchestra. She didn't want to leave, Samuel noticed. "This isn't punishment. It feels like it. I'm not making a decision today." Grace looked away. Samuel continued. "Institutions are like people." She looked back. "They can disappoint you without becoming worthless," Grace thought. "So Wellington can change? It can." "Will it?" Samuel looked toward the road. "That's what we're going to find out." The anonymous survey went out 3 days later. Every student, every faculty member, every family, independent company, confidential responses. The questions were simple. Do you feel you belong at Wellington? Have you witnessed someone treated differently because of race, wealth, financial aid status, religion, disability, or family background? Do you believe adults at Wellington respond consistently when such concerns are reported? Have you ever hidden something about your family because you feared judgment? Samuel expected uncomfortable answers. He didn't expect the scale. 68% of students answered. By the end of the week, patterns appeared. Students receiving financial aid repeatedly described embarrassment around expensive school trips. Some said teachers were wonderful. Others described parents making comments about scholarship kids. Several black students described being mistaken for athletes rather than academic scholars. Asian students reported assumptions about math ability. Jewish students mentioned jokes. Muslim students described questions about terrorism framed as humor. Children of divorced parents described family events that assumed every household had a mother and father attending together. One student wrote, "My mother cleans houses." I tell people she works in property management. Another got into Wellington because of financial aid. My roommate once said poor kids should be grateful and not complain. Another, I am black. 3 parents have asked which sport I play before asking my name. Another, my father is in prison. Nobody here knows. Another, I pretend my grandparents are my parents because my actual parents struggle with addiction. Samuel read every response provided to the board. He sat alone in his study. By midnight, he reached one written by a 14-year-old student. I love Wellington. I just don't think Wellington would love my family if they knew everything about us. Samuel stopped reading. That sentence stayed with him. Love the institution, fear its judgment. He thought about Grace. He thought about himself at 22. Then he thought about money. $30 million could build laboratories. It could hire counselors, fund scholarships, repair buildings. What it couldn't do was purchase character. Character had to be practiced. The next board meeting lasted 4 hours. Some trustees were defensive. One said, every elite school has these issues. Samuel replied, then every elite school should address them. Another said, we shouldn't overreact to anonymous comments. Margaret Ellis looked at him. When people fear consequences for signing their names, anonymity is information. That ended the argument. Samuel proposed 5 reforms: expanded financial support for trips and extracurricular expenses, staff training focused not on slogans but real case studies, a student belonging council, clearer parent conduct expectations at school events, and an independent ombudsman students could contact. A trustee asked, will you restore the $30 million commitment if we approve? Samuel looked at him. No, the trustee blinked. Then what are we discussing? Samuel leaned back. The school. But your donation should not be the reason you do the right thing. The room became quiet. Samuel continued. If these reforms are worthwhile only because I might write a check, then we have learned nothing. Margaret smiled. The trustee looked irritated. With respect, Samuel, philanthropy is part of governance. Yes, and donors have influence. Yes, so pretending your donation isn't part of this is unrealistic. Samuel nodded. Good point. The trustee seemed surprised. Samuel continued, which is exactly why donors need restraint. He looked around the table. Money can distort moral judgment from both directions. Nobody spoke. People ignored me when they thought I had none. Now people are listening too carefully because they know I have a lot. Samuel shook his head. Neither is healthy. After the meeting, Margaret walked with him. You enjoy making wealthy people uncomfortable. Samuel smiled. I enjoy accuracy. Same thing in this building. They walked toward the parking lot. Margaret stopped. How's Grace? Confused. That makes 200 of us. Samuel laughed. Margaret became serious. Are you going to give the money? I don't know. You're really undecided? Yes. Margaret studied him, 20 years ago you would have already decided. Samuel looked at her. Probably. Softened. My knees have, Margaret smiled. Elaine? Samuel looked toward the trees. Mostly. Elaine had changed the way he thought about justice. Samuel's younger instinct had been to fight every insult. Elaine taught him that not every fight deserved the same weapon. Don't burn down a house because one room smells bad, she once told him. Open the windows first. Samuel smiled at the memory. Meanwhile, Grace faced a different challenge. Madison Langford hadn't spoken to her in a week. Then, on Monday afternoon, she appeared beside Grace's locker. Can we talk? Grace continued putting books into her bag. About my mom. No, Madison looked surprised. Grace shut the locker. I don't want to talk about your mom. Okay. Madison remained there. Grace sighed. What? Madison looked miserable. I didn't know. Didn't know what? About your dad, Grace laughed. That's the problem, Madison frowned. What do you mean? You think the important part is that you didn't know he was rich. Madison opened her mouth. Grace continued. If he were poor, would the jokes have been okay? No. If he worked maintenance? No. If he actually needed financial aid? No. Madison looked down. Grace folded her arms. So stop apologizing because you discovered he has money. Madison's eyes filled with tears. I'm not. Grace waited. Madison swallowed. My mom said your dad might cancel his donation. There it was. Grace's face hardened. Of course. No, that's not what I meant. It sounds like exactly what you meant. Madison shook her head. My parents are fighting. Grace paused. Madison continued. My dad thinks Mom embarrassed the family. Mom thinks everybody turned on her because your dad is rich. Grace didn't know what to say. Madison looked toward the floor. She keeps saying she made one mistake. Grace's anger weakened slightly. Did she? Madison looked up. What? Make one mistake? Madison thought. Grace waited. Madison took a breath. My mom talks about scholarship kids sometimes. Grace said nothing. She says Wellington needs balance. What does that mean? I don't know. Yes, you do. Madison looked ashamed. People who can pay. Grace felt something complicated. Anger, sadness, recognition. Madison wasn't merely her mother's victim. She had repeated some of what she'd learned. But maybe learning could run backward too. My dad says some lessons keep our mistakes alive. Madison looked confused. What? Grace smiled faintly. Something old people say. Madison almost laughed. Grace picked up her bag. Are you sorry? Yes. For what? Madison thought carefully. For laughing. Grace waited. For making assumptions about your family. Grace nodded. And for thinking finding out your dad was rich changed why it was wrong. Grace looked at her. That answer was better. Okay, Madison blinked. Okay, I'm not saying we're best friends. I know, but okay. Grace walked away. Madison stood alone. Sometimes forgiveness began with a door opening 1 inch. That evening, Victoria Langford sat in her kitchen drinking wine. Her husband Thomas entered. He removed his tie. You spoke to Madison? Yes, she's upset. So am I. Thomas opened the refrigerator. Victoria watched him. Do you think I'm racist? Thomas stopped. The question hung there. He closed the refrigerator. I think you behaved badly. That's not what I asked. I know. Victoria's face tightened. Everybody suddenly thinks I'm some monster. Thomas sat. I don't. Then say it. He looked at her. I think you've spent years around wealthy people until wealth started feeling like character. Victoria stared. Thomas continued, and I think you sometimes talk about families who have less money like they're guests in our world. Her eyes filled. After everything I've done for that school, this isn't about donations. Apparently it's all about donations. No, Thomas looked tired. It's about you assuming Samuel Carter worked for somebody because of his truck and his skin. Victoria stood. I did not assume that because he's black. Thomas said nothing. Victoria looked at him. Say something. What do you want me to say? That you believe me? I believe you didn't consciously think, he's black, so he must be staff. Victoria nodded quickly. Exactly. Thomas continued. I also think you wouldn't have made the same assumption about an older white man in a tailored suit. Victoria froze. Thomas stood. We all have things we don't like seeing about ourselves. He walked away. Victoria sat alone. For the first time since the reception, she wasn't thinking about Samuel's donation. She was thinking about the old truck. Would she have redirected a white man toward catering? She wanted to say yes. She couldn't. The answer hurt. 3 weeks later, Wellington held a town hall meeting. Parents, students, faculty, board members. Samuel had no intention of speaking. He sat in the back beside Grace. Victoria sat near the front. The first hour was uncomfortable. Students spoke. A senior receiving financial aid described skipping a class ski trip because his family couldn't afford the extra $2,000. A black mother said 3 parents had mistaken her for a staff member over 4 years. An Asian father said people constantly asked whether his daughter planned to attend MIT, despite her passion being theater. A white working-class father described feeling embarrassed because everyone assumed parents could take weekdays off for events. Nobody was attacked. That made the testimony harder to dismiss. These were ordinary experiences, ordinary hurts, ordinary assumptions. Then Victoria Langford stood. Grace stiffened. Samuel watched. Victoria walked toward the microphone. Her hands trembled. "My name is Victoria Langford. Everybody knew. I've chaired the Parents Association for 4 years." She looked around. 3 weeks ago I met Samuel Carter." Samuel remained still. I assumed he was staff. A murmur moved through the room. Victoria continued. "Then I learned he was wealthy." She paused, and I was horrified. Samuel studied her. At first, I thought I was horrified because I'd made an embarrassing mistake. Her voice cracked slightly, but my husband asked me a question. She looked toward Thomas. He asked whether I would have made the same assumption about an older white man dressed exactly the same way. Silence. I wanted the answer to be yes. Victoria looked down. It wasn't. Grace looked at Samuel. Samuel didn't move. Victoria continued. "I don't know what label that gives me." She swallowed. "But I know I don't want to defend something just because I'm ashamed of seeing it." Samuel's expression softened. Victoria turned slightly toward him. "Mr. Carter, I owe you an apology." Samuel nodded once. She then looked toward Grace. "And Grace, I owe you one too." Grace's eyes widened. But more importantly, Victoria looked at the audience. "I owe one to the people I treated this way who couldn't threaten a donation." That changed the room. Samuel looked down. Elaine would have approved. Victoria continued. "I've spent years believing generosity excused arrogance." She took a breath. "It doesn't." Then she returned to her seat. No dramatic applause, just silence. Samuel preferred it that way. Real accountability shouldn't always receive a standing ovation. Sometimes it needed to be uncomfortable. Grace whispered, "Do you forgive her?" Samuel smiled. "Everybody keeps asking me that." "Well, I'm considering it." Grace nudged him. "Old people take forever. That's why we survive." At the end of the meeting, Headmaster Whitmore announced the first reforms. No mention of Samuel's donation. That mattered. The board had approved changes without knowing whether the money would come. Samuel waited until the room emptied, then approached Whitmore. "Charles." Whitmore turned. "Samuel, proceed with the campaign." Whitmore stared. "What? The 30 million?" Whitmore's mouth opened. Samuel held up a hand. "Conditions, of course. 10 million goes directly to scholarships." Whitmore nodded. 5 million establishes emergency assistance for trips, books, technology, uniforms, anything tuition doesn't cover. Agreed. 5 million for faculty housing. Yes, 5 million for the belonging and student support program. Whitmore hesitated. "That's substantial. So is the problem." Whitmore nodded. "And the last 5? Samuel smiled. "Anonymous." Whitmore laughed. "Samuel. Anonymous. Fine." Samuel held out his hand. Whitmore shook it. Then Samuel added, "And no building name." Whitmore sighed dramatically. "You are the most irritating philanthropist in America. I work hard at it." Behind them, Grace had heard everything. She stared at her father. $30 million. He turned. "What? You were really going to give 30 million?" Sam looked uncomfortable, apparently. "That's insane." "It is." Grace stared at him. "You give me $20 for the movies. That's also philanthropy." "Dad!" Samuel laughed. Grace shook her head. Then something occurred to her. "Why don't you want your name on anything?" Samuel looked around Wellington Hall. "Because I already know my name." Grace waited. Samuel smiled. "I don't need a building to remind me." Grace hugged him. Samuel closed his eyes. For the first time in weeks, he felt hopeful about Wellington. But the story wasn't over, because 4 days later, an investigative reporter learned the identity of the anonymous donor. And by Sunday morning, Samuel Carter's photograph appeared on the front page of the Richmond Chronicle. Secret benefactor behind Wellington Academy reforms revealed. The article spread nationally. By Monday, television trucks were outside Samuel's house, and suddenly, the man who had spent years avoiding attention could no longer walk into a grocery store without someone recognizing him. Worse, the story online changed. Some headlines called him, "Billionaire Dad Gets Revenge on Racist Elite School." Others, "Wealthy Father Threatens School After Daughter Insulted." Samuel hated both, because both missed the point. And when a national television network offered him a primetime interview, Samuel initially refused. Then he saw one headline that finally changed his mind. "Millionaire Donor Humiliated. School Learns Costly Lesson." Samuel stared at it. Costly lesson. Lesson wasn't that insulting. Rich people was expensive. The lesson was that humiliating anyone was wrong. Samuel picked up the phone. "I'll do the interview." Grace looked at him. "You hate interviews." "I do." "Then why?" Samuel showed her the headline. "Because everybody learned the wrong lesson." The network expected Samuel Carter to talk about racism. He did. They expected him to talk about wealth. He did. What they did not expect was Samuel to spend most of the interview talking about a cafeteria worker named Leonard. The interview took place in Wellington's library, Samuel insisted. No luxury home, no company headquarters, no dramatic photographs of private wealth, just books. The interviewer was Caroline Price, 59, one of the country's most respected television journalists. She sat across from Samuel. Cameras rolled. "Mr. Carter, much of America now knows your story," Samuel smiled. "Unfortunately," Caroline laughed. "Why unfortunately?" "Because being recognized at the hardware store makes buying plumbing supplies complicated." Caroline smiled, then turned serious. "You were mistaken for staff at your daughter's school." "Yes." "You were spoken to as though you were receiving charity." "Yes." "Then the people involved discovered you're worth hundreds of millions of dollars." Samuel shifted. "I don't discuss precise numbers. But you're extremely wealthy. I've been fortunate." Caroline raised an eyebrow. "That's a very billionaire's answer." Samuel laughed. "Fair," she continued. "Many people online are celebrating this as a story about people discovering they mocked the wrong man." Samuel's face changed. "That's why I'm here." Caroline waited. "They didn't mock the wrong man." She frowned slightly. Samuel continued. "They behaved wrongly." Pause. "Those are different lessons." Caroline leaned forward. "Explain." "If your conclusion is, be careful who you disrespect because they might secretly be rich, you've learned nothing." The camera moved closer. Samuel's voice remained calm. "You shouldn't respect me because I can donate $30 million. He paused. "You should respect Leonard." "Who is Leonard?" Samuel smiled. "He works in Wellington's cafeteria." Caroline looked surprised. "I met him 3 years ago," Samuel continued. "His wife has multiple sclerosis. He works 2 jobs. His son served in Afghanistan." Samuel looked toward the camera. "Leonard cannot build you a science center." Pause. "He deserves exactly as much dignity as I do." Caroline was silent. Samuel continued. "We have become too interested in stories where someone insults a janitor and discovers he's secretly the CEO." He shook his head. "Why does the janitor need to secretly be somebody else?" That clip later became the most shared portion of the interview, but Caroline continued. "Do you believe what happened was racism?" Samuel took his time. Race was part of it. Part class was part. Appearance, assumptions, familiarity. Samuel folded his hands. Human prejudice is rarely convenient enough to arrive wearing a name tag. Caroline smiled faintly. "That's a good line. It's an annoying truth." She asked, "Did Victoria Langford apologize?" "Yes. Did you accept?" Yes, immediately. No. Why not? Samuel smiled. I'm 71, not a saint, Caroline laughed. Then she became serious again. Some critics say her apology only came after learning you were wealthy. Initially, I believe that's true, but later, Samuel thought, I think she became embarrassed by something deeper. Do you trust that? I don't need perfect certainty. He looked at Caroline. If we only accept change from people whose motives are flawless, nobody gets to change. The interviewer paused. That's unusually forgiving. No, Samuel shook his head. Forgiveness and accountability aren't opposites, he continued. I don't trust apologies that request amnesia. Caroline smiled. Meaning, if someone says sorry and expects you to pretend nothing happened, that's not accountability. What is? Naming what happened. Repairing what you can. Changing behavior. The interview moved to his childhood. Samuel rarely discussed it publicly. He was born in 1955 in rural North Carolina. His father, James Carter, repaired railroad equipment. His mother, Louise, worked as a school cafeteria cook. The family had little money, but James owned 2 suits, Sunday suit, funeral suit. Samuel's mother laughed that both were the same suit. At 15, Samuel told his father he wanted to become an engineer. James had no idea exactly what engineers did. But he saved enough money to buy Samuel a used drafting set. Samuel still owned it. Caroline asked, Did your upbringing shape the way you handle wealth? Samuel nodded. My father used to say money tells you what something costs, not what it's worth. Caroline smiled. He sounds like you. No, Samuel shook his head. I sound like him. He described Elaine, how they met, how she taught high school history for 18 years before helping run their foundation, how she wanted scholarships to preserve dignity. She hated programs that made poor students perform gratitude. Caroline frowned. What do you mean? Sometimes institutions expect people receiving help to constantly prove they're thankful. Samuel's expression became serious. Gratitude is good. Humiliation isn't, he described grace. Then Caroline asked the question Samuel knew would come. Why did you send your daughter to an elite school when you have concerns about elite culture? Samuel laughed. Because contradiction is part of parenting. Caroline smiled. Samuel continued. Wellington is excellent in many ways. Great teachers, outstanding programs, strong students. He paused. Good institutions can have blind spots. Caroline looked at him. Do you believe Wellington is racist? No. The answer was immediate. That's going to surprise some people. Why? Because of your experience. Samuel leaned forward. Calling an entire institution racist can sometimes become a shortcut that prevents more precise work, he continued. Wellington had behaviors and attitudes that needed confronting. Some connected to race, some to wealth, some to status, some to the strange social bubble expensive schools can create. He paused. The solution isn't branding everybody evil, it's making people responsible. That statement divided the internet. Some people praised Samuel, others said he was too forgiving. Some said he minimized racism. Others said he exaggerated ordinary misunderstandings. Samuel read very little commentary. Grace read too much. Dad sat at breakfast 2 mornings later. What? People are fighting about you online. That seems exhausting. One guy said you're a coward. Samuel spread jam on toast. How many followers? Grace checked. 32. Samuel nodded. Devastating. She laughed. Another person says you're an elitist billionaire trying to control education. Probably more interesting. Do you care about strangers? Samuel considered. I care when criticism contains truth. How do you know I listen? To everybody? No. That would kill me. Grace smiled. Samuel continued. You learn to separate discomfort from danger. Grace frowned. What does that mean? Sometimes criticism hurts because it's unfair. He took a bite. Sometimes it hurts because it's accurate. Do you tell? Samuel smiled. That's not useful. Then wait 55 years. Grace threw a napkin at him. At school, Wellington changed. Slowly, not magically. Some parents hated the new focus. One withdrew his son. Another complained that discussions of class were political. Several students mocked the belonging council. But other things improved. Trip assistance became automatic and confidential. Students stopped having to explain financial hardship to multiple adults. Parent orientation included discussions about class assumptions. Faculty learned to avoid scheduling every major parent event at noon on weekdays. The school employed a full-time counselor focused on inclusion and belonging. Grace joined the student council. So did Madison. Their relationship remained complicated. One afternoon, they sat together after a meeting. Madison looked at Grace. "Do you think my mom ruined everything?" Grace frowned. "What do you mean? People look at her differently." Grace considered. "She did something wrong." "I know. That doesn't mean she's only the worst thing she ever did." Madison looked surprised. "Your dad say that?" Grace smiled. "Mr. Henderson," Madison laughed. "Of course." Then she became serious. "My mom quit the Parents Association, I heard. She started volunteering with the scholarship office." Grace blinked. "Really?" "Yeah." "Why?" Madison shrugged. "She says she needs to spend time with people she spent years talking about without knowing." Grace didn't answer. That sounded sincere. Maybe discomfort could become education. At the end of the semester, Wellington held its winter concert. Samuel sat beside Victoria Langford. Neither planned it. The auditorium was nearly full. Victoria arrived late. Only one seat remained. Beside Samuel, she stopped. Samuel looked up. "Mrs. Langford, Mr. Carter," he gestured. "Seats available." She sat. Awkward silence. Orchestra students tuned instruments. Victoria whispered, "Madison says Grace is playing violin. Second violin. My daughter plays cello, I know." More silence. Then Victoria said, "I watched your interview." Samuel sighed. "So did everybody. You mentioned Leonard." Samuel nodded. "I met him." Samuel turned. "The cafeteria worker." "I know who Leonard is." Victoria looked embarrassed. "I didn't before." Samuel waited. She continued. "I've attended Wellington events 8 years, and I don't think I'd ever asked his name." Samuel remained silent. Victoria looked toward the stage. "That bothered me. It should." She nodded. "You're not very comforting. My daughter tells me that." Victoria smiled faintly. Then she asked, "Do you think people can really change at my age?" Samuel looked at her. "How old are you?" 53. Samuel laughed. Victoria frowned. "What? You're talking like you're waiting for hospice." She laughed despite herself. Samuel continued. "My father changed his mind about women working outside the home at 62. My mother learned to drive at 67. I started cooking at 65. Badly." Victoria smiled. Samuel looked at the stage. "Age makes changing harder because we've practiced being ourselves longer." He paused. "But harder isn't impossible." Victoria nodded. The lights dimmed. Grace entered with the orchestra. Samuel's face changed immediately. Pride, pure and uncomplicated, Victoria noticed. For all the headlines about billionaire Samuel Carter, this man looked exactly like every other father in the auditorium. He raised his phone. Grace saw him. She mouthed, "No video." Samuel pretended not to understand. Grace rolled her eyes. Victoria laughed. "She hates that?" "Yes, Madison too." Samuel looked at her. Teenagers may be the one thing that unifies humanity. The orchestra began. For 90 minutes, nobody discussed race, money, donations, scandals. They listened to children make music. Afterward, Samuel found Grace backstage. "You recorded." "Evidence. I saw you." "Allegation." Grace hugged him. Madison approached with Victoria. The four stood together awkwardly. Then Madison smiled. "Mr. Carter, my mom says your truck is terrible." Victoria's face went red. "I did not." Samuel laughed. "Your mother is correct." Grace looked delighted. Finally, Samuel turned to Victoria. "It has character. It has rust. Character." Victoria smiled. Something had shifted. Not forgotten, not erased, but repaired slightly. On the drive home, Grace asked, "Do you like her now?" Samuel looked horrified. "Let's not become reckless," Grace laughed. Then Samuel became serious. "I understand her better." "Is that the same thing?" "No, but it helps." Grace stared out the window. "Yes, are you glad everybody found out about the money?" Samuel thought. "No, why? Because now I can't tell who's being nice because they like me." Grace smiled. "Maybe they like your truck, then I know they're lying." They laughed. At a stoplight, Grace looked at him. "Mom would have liked what happened." Samuel's smile faded. "What part? The school changing?" Samuel nodded. "Yes, and the scholarship money." "Yes." Grace hesitated, and Victoria apologizing. Samuel looked through the windshield. "Your mother believed people were capable of becoming better than their worst habits." Grace smiled. "Do you?" Samuel took a long breath. "I've spent most of my life trying to." By spring, Wellington appeared to have survived the controversy. Applications increased. Donations remained stable. The Belonging Initiative received national attention. Headmaster Whitmore joked that Samuel had accidentally become a public relations consultant. Samuel threatened to charge fees. Then, in April, everything changed. A major financial problem emerged. For nearly 6 years, Wellington's former chief financial officer had placed part of the school's operating reserve into investment products that were far riskier than board policy allowed. No money had been stolen. That almost made the situation worse. It wasn't criminal greed, it was institutional complacency. The investments suffered severe losses during a sudden market correction. Wellington faced a projected $22 million shortfall over 3 years. The school could survive, but only by making painful choices. Tuition increases, faculty layoffs, reduction in scholarship aid, delayed building repairs. Headmaster Whitmore called Samuel. "We have a problem." Samuel listened, then drove to campus. The emergency board meeting lasted 6 hours. Trustees argued. One proposed reducing financial aid by 30%. Samuel immediately opposed it. "We don't solve financial mistakes by removing students least able to absorb them." Another trustee said, "We have contractual obligations to faculty and moral obligations to families. Morality doesn't balance a budget." Samuel looked at him. "Neither does panic." Margaret Ellis intervened. "We need options." Samuel requested the financial models. He spent 2 days reviewing them. Old habits returned. Engineering had trained Samuel to think structurally. Buildings failed when loads traveled through weak points. Organizations did too. The problem was not simply $22 million. It was timing. Wellington needed liquidity. Samuel could write the check. Everyone knew it. Nobody asked. That pleased him. 3 years earlier, perhaps they would have. Now the board seemed to understand something. Samuel's money wasn't a rescue button. On the 3rd day, he met with Whitmore. "I'll provide a $10 million bridge loan." Whitmore stared. "Loan, 0 interest. Why not a gift?" "Because the school needs discipline." Whitmore smiled faintly. "There's the engineer," Samuel continued. "Another $5 million as a matching grant." 4. Alumni contributions and scholarships? Protected. Whitmore nodded. "We can make that work, but there's another condition." Whitmore sighed. "Of course, financial transparency, meaning annual public summary." Whitmore looked uneasy. "Private schools don't usually—" "I don't care," Samuel continued. "Families entrust institutions with children and money. They deserve to understand significant financial risk." Whitmore nodded slowly. "Anything else?" "Yes." Samuel smiled. "No building name." Whitmore groaned. "You're impossible." The rescue campaign began. Something unexpected happened. Families contributed, not only wealthy ones. A teacher donated $500. A cafeteria employee gave $50. Leonard gave $25. Samuel discovered this and immediately objected. "He earns hourly wages." Whitmore smiled. He insisted. Samuel found Leonard during lunch. "You gave money." Leonard looked suspicious. "Who told you?" "Charles, headmaster, talks too much." Samuel laughed. "Why?" Leonard shrugged. My granddaughter might come here someday. You don't need to give money to deserve that. I know. Samuel looked at him. Leonard continued. That's why I gave it. Samuel understood. There was dignity in receiving. There was also dignity in giving. Wealth didn't have a monopoly on generosity. Samuel shook Leonard's hand. Thank you. Leonard smiled. You paying for lunch? Samuel laughed. I thought you worked here. I do. Then why am I paying? Because you're rich. Samuel laughed so hard people turned. Within 8 weeks, alumni and families raised $9 million. Samuel matched 5. The remaining structural deficit was addressed through expense reductions that preserved scholarship levels. Wellington survived. But during that campaign, a difficult decision emerged. The school could no longer afford a planned luxury renovation of the alumni club. Victoria Langford had strongly supported it years earlier. Now she spoke at the board session. Cancel it. Everyone looked at her. She continued. Use the designated unrestricted funds for faculty housing. One trustee asked, You've been advocating that club renovation for 5 years. Victoria nodded. I was wrong. No speech, no drama, just those words. I was wrong. Samuel smiled. Sometimes change looked exactly that ordinary. In June, Wellington held graduation. Grace wasn't graduating yet. She had 1 more year. Samuel attended because Mr. Henderson was retiring. 41 years teaching literature. The school auditorium was packed. Henderson gave the commencement address. He spoke about success. Wellington graduates are accustomed to achievement. He smiled. Unfortunately, achievement can become dangerous. Parents laughed uncertainly. Henderson continued. If you become successful, people will begin confusing what you have accomplished with who you are. He looked toward Samuel. Don't help them. Samuel smiled. Henderson continued. Money is useful. Education is powerful. Reputation opens doors. Titles create authority. He paused. But none of those things create character. The room quieted. Character appears in the moments when you believe nobody important is watching. Samuel felt the words, nobody important. That was the entire story. Victoria had believed Samuel wasn't important. Other parents believed he was staff. Students believed Grace might be poor. Then everything changed when the money became known. Henderson continued. One of the greatest moral traps in life is treating people according to what they can do for you. He looked at the graduates. If you become powerful, learn people's names who cannot advance your career. If you become wealthy, respect people who cannot return your generosity. If you become educated, don't use knowledge to make other people feel small. If you become important, he smiled, remember that you're still not as important as your mother thinks you are. Laughter filled the auditorium. Samuel clapped. After the ceremony, he found Henderson. Stealing my material? Henderson smiled. Good teachers steal selectively. Samuel shook his hand. Retirement. Terrifying. What will you do? Read books nobody pays me to explain. Sounds irresponsible. Grace appeared. She hugged Henderson. I hate that you're leaving. Good. She stepped back. Good? Students should occasionally miss teachers. Grace wiped her eyes. Henderson looked at Samuel. Take care of her. Samuel smiled. Trying. Henderson looked at Grace. And you take care of him. Grace nodded. He forgets his glasses. They're usually on his head. Samuel touched his head. His glasses were there. Both laughed. That summer, Samuel took Grace to North Carolina, not to a resort, to the town where he grew up. The house was gone. A convenience store stood where it had been, but the church remained, the railroad yard, the elementary school. Samuel showed Grace the cafeteria where his mother once worked. The building had become offices. My grandmother worked here? 32 years. Did she like it? Samuel smiled. She complained every morning. Grace laughed. Sounds like you, Samuel continued, but she loved feeding children. They walked toward the old rail yard. Grandpa fixed trains, equipment. Was he good? The best? Did he make much money? No. Grace looked at Samuel. Did that bother you when I was young? Why? Because I confused money with success. Grace waited. Samuel looked toward the tracks. My father never owned much. He never traveled outside the country, never had a new car, never had investments. He smiled. But when he died, 300 people came to his funeral. Grace's eyes widened. Why? Because he'd spent 67 years helping people. Samuel looked at her. I've known billionaires who couldn't fill 20 chairs, Grace understood. They returned to Virginia 2 days later. At Wellington, another school year began, Grace's senior year. She had changed, not dramatically. She still rolled her eyes at Samuel, still hated his music, still believed his phone required technological supervision, but she had become less concerned with appearing wealthy. She wore inexpensive clothes on weekends, worked at a bookstore that summer even though she didn't need the money. Samuel asked why. I want coworkers, you have classmates. That's not the same. She worked 20 hours a week. Her first paycheck was $283 after taxes. She stared at it. Taxes are robbery, Samuel laughed for 5 minutes. Welcome to civilization. Grace saved half, spent some, donated $20 to an animal shelter. Samuel didn't praise her excessively. Elaine hated making charity into performance. He simply said, good choice. During senior year, Grace and Madison became genuine friends. Not perfect, they still argued. But their friendship had survived something shallow friendships couldn't. Truth. One afternoon, Madison visited the Carter house. She looked around. This is your house? Grace nodded. Madison seemed confused. It's normal, Samuel was reading nearby. He lowered the newspaper. Terribly disappointing, isn't it? Madison turned red. No, sir, Grace laughed. Dad, Samuel continued reading. Madison whispered, thought you'd have, like, a mansion. We do. Madison looked around. Grace whispered, this is what he calls it. Samuel raised his voice. I can hear you. Grace smiled. Old but not deaf. Samuel replied, debatable. They laughed. Then Madison noticed a small photograph of Elaine. Your mom? Grace nodded. She died when I was 7. I'm sorry, thanks. Madison looked at the photograph. She looks nice, Samuel said quietly. She was. The room changed. For a moment, wealth disappeared. School disappeared. Race disappeared. 2 teenage girls looked at a photograph of a woman one of them barely remembered, and the other never knew. Life was simpler than people made it, and more complicated. That evening, after Madison left, Grace sat beside Samuel. Dad? Yes? Do you think Mom would like who I am? Samuel folded the newspaper. He looked at his daughter. The question surprised him. Why would you ask that? I don't know, Samuel thought, then smiled. She'd love who you are. Grace waited. Would she like everything you do? Grace laughed. She'd hate your bedroom. I know. Your phone addiction. Okay. Your habit of leaving cups everywhere. Dad, Samuel smiled. But love isn't the reward for becoming someone perfect. Grace looked down. Samuel continued. Your mother loved you before you had any achievements. Before Wellington. Before grades. Before you could even speak. He touched her hand. That's the kind of love people spend their whole lives trying to understand. Grace leaned against him. Samuel looked at Elaine's photograph. He hoped he'd gotten the answer right. 1 year later, Grace Carter stood behind a podium in Wellington Academy's auditorium. Graduate Day. Samuel sat in the 3rd row, not first. He could have sat first. He didn't care. He wore the brown suit. Grace had forbidden it. Samuel believed graduation provided fathers constitutional immunity. Margaret Ellis sat beside him. She looked at the suit. Elaine let you buy that? Elaine bought it. When? 98, Margaret nodded. That explains several things, Samuel smiled. Grace was valedictorian. She had spent 3 weeks writing her speech. Samuel was not allowed to read it. He suspected danger. Grace adjusted the microphone. Good morning. Parents settled. Students smiled. Grace looked toward Samuel. My father is wearing a terrible brown suit. The auditorium erupted in laughter. Samuel looked offended. Margaret applauded. Grace continued. He was specifically instructed not to. More laughter. Samuel mouthed, "Respect your elders." Grace smiled. Then her expression became serious. 2 years ago, I almost left Wellington. The room quieted. Most knew the story. Some people made assumptions about my father. She paused. And about me. Samuel watched carefully. Grace continued. What happened next became public. Too public. People laughed. For a while, I was angry. I wanted people who embarrassed my father to be embarrassed themselves. Victoria sat several rows away. Grace looked toward her. Some were. Victoria smiled faintly. Grace continued. But anger is strange. It can tell you something is wrong. It isn't always good at telling you what to build afterward. Samuel's eyes widened slightly. That was good, Grace went on. My father likes bridges. Samuel smiled. He spent his career building them. When I was little, I thought bridges were boring. Samuel looked offended again. Now I understand why he likes them. Grace looked across the graduates. A bridge exists because separation is real. 2 sides, a gap, something difficult to cross. She paused. But the existence of the gap doesn't mean the sides have to remain disconnected. Samuel's throat tightened. Grace continued. Wellington changed during my years here, not because one wealthy donor got angry. Samuel looked down. Good girl. It changed because students told the truth. Teachers listened. Parents admitted mistakes. Administrators accepted criticism. And people who could have walked away decided to stay and build. Grace looked toward Victoria. Mrs. Langford taught me something without intending to. Victoria's face changed. She taught me that a person can hurt you. Grace paused. And still become more than the person who hurt you. Victoria began crying. Samuel looked toward her. Grace continued. Mr. Henderson taught me that belonging isn't something wealthy people grant. It exists before invitation. Leonard in the cafeteria taught me everyone's name matters. Leonard, standing near the back, looked shocked. Grace smiled. And my father, she looked at Samuel. Samuel immediately pretended to inspect his program. Everyone laughed. Grace's voice softened. My father taught me that money can buy access. It can buy buildings, education, comfort, security. It can even buy really ugly suits. Samuel shook his head. But money cannot buy dignity. Grace paused. Because dignity isn't for sale. Silence. It belongs to people before anyone decides whether they're useful. Samuel looked at his daughter. Elaine. He saw Elaine everywhere, Grace finished. As we leave Wellington, most of us will spend our lives trying to become something. Doctors, lawyers, artists, scientists, business owners, parents. Looked at her classmates. Whatever you become, don't become so impressed by what someone has achieved that you forget to respect people who haven't had the same chances. And don't become so impressed by your own success that you need another person's smallness to feel large. The room remained silent. Then Grace smiled. Also, call your parents. Parents applauded. Students groaned. Samuel laughed. Thank you. Grace stepped away. The auditorium rose. Samuel didn't. For several seconds he couldn't. His eyes filled. Margaret handed him a tissue. Allergies? Samuel smiled. Severe. After graduation, Grace found him outside. She wore her cap crooked. You cried. No, Dad. Allergies, in June, rare summer variety. Grace laughed and hugged him. Samuel closed his eyes. 17 years. How could 17 years disappear that quickly? He remembered carrying her through the hospital hallway after she was born. Elaine, exhausted and smiling. He remembered Grace's first day of kindergarten, her mother's funeral, first violin recital, first driving lesson, now graduation. Life didn't move gradually when you looked backward. It jumped. Grace stepped back. Did you like the speech? Mostly. The suit commentary was unnecessary. It was essential. Samuel smiled. Then Headmaster Whitmore approached. Samuel Charles, Grace. Mr. Whitmore. Whitmore handed Samuel a folder. Samuel frowned. What's this? Final approval. Samuel opened it. The Elaine Carter Opportunity Fund. 10 years of scholarships, not only tuition, books, travel, meals, technology, emergency family support. Samuel had committed another $20 million months earlier. This time Grace knew. The fund carried Elaine's name. That was the one naming exception Samuel allowed. Grace read it. Her eyes filled. Dad, Samuel looked at her. Your mother would have hated the attention. Grace laughed through tears. Then why? Because some names remind us what money is supposed to do. Grace hugged him again. Whitmore smiled. A photographer approached. Mr. Carter, could we get a picture beside the new donor plaque? Samuel immediately said, no. The photographer froze. Whitmore laughed. Grace shook her head. Of course, Samuel continued. Take one with the scholarship recipients. The photographer nodded. 20 students gathered, different races, different backgrounds, some wealthy, some not. Samuel stood at the edge. The photographer gestured. Mr. Carter, center please. Samuel shook his head. Students in the center. Grace smiled. The photograph was taken. Years later, it would hang in Wellington's administration building. Samuel Carter stood almost outside the frame, exactly where he preferred. 5 months after graduation, Grace left for college. She chose Northwestern. Samuel complained about Chicago weather. Grace accused him of worrying. He denied it. On move-in day, Samuel drove the old Ford. Grace insisted. The truck survived the trip. Barely. As they carried boxes into her dormitory, another father looked at Samuel. Need a hand? Samuel smiled. Always. They moved boxes together. The man had no idea who Samuel was. Samuel loved him immediately. Afterward, Grace stood beside the truck. You okay? Samuel nodded. Fine, you look sad. Allergies, said. He smiled. I'm going to miss you. Grace hugged him. I'll call. How often? Once a week. Daily, twice a week. Daily, 3 times. Samuel sighed. Negotiation skills need work. Grace smiled. Then she became serious. Thank you for Wellington. Samuel shook his head. You earned Wellington, not the tuition. I had help. From who? He looked upward. Your mother. Grace nodded. Samuel opened the driver's door. Before climbing in, Grace asked, Dad? Yes? Why did you keep the truck all these years? Samuel looked at it. Faded paint. Dent. Rust. He thought for a moment. I bought it the year Carter Engineering got its first major federal contract. Grace smiled. So sentimental? Partly. And? Samuel ran his hand across the hood. That year, everyone started treating me differently. Grace waited. The truck reminded me I was still the same person. Grace's expression softened. Samuel continued. It's easy to forget yourself when other people become impressed. He climbed in. Grace leaned through the window. Drive safe, study, yes. Eat, yes. Sleep, Dad, call, go home. Samuel laughed. He drove away. Grace watched the old Ford disappear. Years passed. Samuel became 75, then 78. His hair became almost completely white. The truck finally stopped running. Completely. The mechanic said the repair would cost more than the vehicle was worth. Samuel stared at him. That's an opinion, the mechanic laughed. Grace was now 23 and attending law school. She called, "Dad, let it die. Disrespectful. It's a truck. It's family. It leaks oil. So do older relatives." Grace laughed for 30 seconds. Eventually Samuel agreed, but he didn't sell it. He donated the truck to a vocational school where students rebuilt engines. A year later, photographs arrived. Teenagers standing beside the restored Ford. Fresh navy paint, rebuilt engine, new seats. Samuel stared at the photographs, then laughed. Elaine's picture was beside him. They fixed it. He framed the photo. Wellington continued evolving. No institution becomes perfect. New controversies came. Different students raised different concerns. Some reforms failed, others worked, but one tradition remained. Every incoming parent attended a session titled Dignity Before Status. Samuel hated the title. Too dramatic. Grace loved it. At the session, parents heard a short story. Years earlier, a black father arrived at a school event. He drove an old truck. Several people assumed he was staff. Others assumed his family received financial aid. Some treated him differently because of those assumptions. Later, they learned he was the largest donor in school history. Then the presenter asked one question: at what point did he become worthy of respect? The correct answer was obvious: before anyone knew his name, before anyone knew his money, before anyone knew what he could give. That question became part of Wellington's culture. Samuel never attended those sessions. He didn't need to. At 81, Samuel returned to Wellington for the dedication of a new scholarship residence. Headmaster Whitmore had retired. Margaret Ellis walked with a cane. Victoria Langford had become a board member focused on financial accessibility. Leonard had retired from the cafeteria. Mr. Henderson had died 2 years earlier. Grace attended with her husband and their 4-year-old daughter, Elaine. Samuel complained that naming the child Elaine created confusion. Grace ignored him. Little Elaine held Samuel's hand. "Grandpa Sam? Yes, Mom says you paid for this school." Samuel looked horrified. "Your mother exaggerates." Grace laughed. "Dad," the child pointed toward Horizon Hall. "Did you build that?" Samuel looked at the science building. "No, you paid. Partly, then you built it." Samuel crouched slowly. His knees protested. Lots of people built it. Who? Architects, engineers, construction workers, teachers, people who donated. People who studied inside, little Elaine considered. "That's a lot." Samuel smiled. "Most good things take a lot of people." Grace watched. Then little Elaine asked, "Why isn't your name on it?" Samuel smiled. "Because I know my name." Grace's eyes filled. Same answer, decades later. Samuel stood. He looked across Wellington. Students walked beneath the trees. A cafeteria worker pushed a cart. Samuel waved. The worker waved back. 2 parents carried boxes. One wore an expensive suit. Another wore paint-stained jeans. Samuel smiled. Not because Wellington had solved prejudice. No institution ever completely did. But because the school had learned to notice. Sometimes progress wasn't becoming incapable of mistakes. It was becoming unwilling to ignore them. Grace slipped her arm through Samuel's. "You tired?" "A little." "Want to sit?" "In a minute." They walked toward a bench. Little Elaine ran ahead. Samuel looked toward the main entrance. He remembered arriving years earlier. Old pickup, charcoal suit. A woman redirecting him towards catering. Grace ashamed. Samuel angry. $30 million hanging invisibly in the background. At the time, everyone thought the twist in the story was Samuel's wealth. It wasn't. The money was merely the thing that forced people to pay attention. The real twist was simpler. Samuel Carter had always been exactly as valuable before they knew he was rich as he was afterward. That was true of Leonard, true of Grace, true of Victoria, true of every scholarship student, true of every janitor, every parent, every teacher, every child. Human worth was not an account balance, Not a job title, not a school name, not a house, not a car, not a color. Samuel had spent nearly 80 years watching America struggle with that lesson. Maybe it always would. But struggle did not mean failure. It meant the lesson required repeating. Again and again and again. Little Elaine ran back. "Grandpa Sam, yes, race you." Samuel stared at her. "I'm 81, so." Laughed. Samuel pointed toward the bench. "First one there wins." Little Elaine ran. Samuel walked. "You're cheating," she shouted. "I'm strategizing." Grace laughed. They reached the bench. Little Elaine climbed beside him. Samuel looked across the campus. The afternoon sun touched the red brick buildings. Students laughed in the distance. A bell rang. For a moment, Samuel thought about his father, James Carter, railroad worker, 2 suits, no investments, 300 people at his funeral, then Elaine, teacher, wife, mother, the woman who believed scholarships should never require humiliation, then Grace, the frightened 16-year-old who once wondered whether she belonged. Now a lawyer, mother, and one day, perhaps, the person teaching another child the same lesson. Samuel leaned back. Life had given him more money than he ever expected. It had also taken things no amount of money could restore. Parents, friends, Elaine, time. That was why Samuel understood wealth better at 81 than he had at 40. Real wealth wasn't possessing enough money to make people treat you differently. It was becoming secure enough in yourself that their treatment didn't define you. Little Elaine rested her head against his arm. "Grandpa? Yes, are you rich?" Grace looked at Samuel. Samuel smiled. "Very." The child looked impressed. "How much money?" Samuel laughed. "Not that kind of rich." Grace smiled. Little Elaine frowned. "What kind?" Samuel looked at his granddaughter, then at Grace, then toward Wellington. "The kind you don't count." Little Elaine clearly didn't understand. That was okay. She had years. Samuel kissed the top of her head. And somewhere behind them, inside Horizon Hall, another student opened a textbook purchased through a scholarship funded by a man whose name did not appear on the building. That was enough. More than enough. Because the greatest gift Samuel Carter ever gave Wellington Academy was not $25 million, or $30 million. Or another scholarship endowment years later. It was a question the school eventually learned to ask itself whenever status threatened to replace character. How would we treat this person if we believed they had nothing to give us? The answer revealed everything. Closing message for the video may be you've known someone like Samuel. A quiet father, a hard-working grandfather, a woman who never talks about what she has accomplished. A man whose old clothes make strangers assume they know his story. Sometimes the people we underestimate are carrying histories we cannot see. But this story isn't a reminder to be careful, because the stranger in front of you might secretly be a millionaire. It's a reminder that he shouldn't need to be one. The janitor deserves dignity. The waitress deserves dignity. The cashier deserves dignity. The wealthy donor deserves dignity. The person receiving charity deserves dignity. The parent driving the oldest car in the parking lot deserves dignity. And the child whose family cannot afford what everyone else takes for granted deserves dignity too. Money can change the way the world responds to a person. Character determines whether we allow it to change the way we respond. Samuel Carter spent his life building bridges, but perhaps the most important bridge he ever helped build wasn't made of steel or concrete. It was the bridge between judgment and understanding, between embarrassment and accountability, between making a mistake and becoming better afterward. If you're older, you've probably lived long enough to know that people are rarely as simple as the first impression we form about them. We all carry stories, losses, sacrifices, private victories, private fears, and we all deserve the chance to be known before being judged. If this story touched you, share it with someone who still believes kindness and dignity matter. Subscribe to the channel for more powerful American stories about family, justice, second chances, hidden strength, and the lessons that sometimes take a lifetime to understand. And until the next story, remember Samuel Carter's question. How would you treat someone if you believed they had absolutely nothing to offer you? Your answer may reveal more about your character than anything money could ever buy.